I want to talk about Beverly Hills Cop a tiny bit because in your post that you haven't put out yet, but maybe it'll be out by the time, you had some things to say that I want to not refute, but nudge you about. So Beverly Hills Cop is the 1984 film as well? Is it?
I'll look it up. You talk.
Starring Eddie Murphy, and I've been like kind of lazily rewatching some 70s, 80s buddy cop stuff.
It's 84.
In part because I was in the mood for San Francisco stuff, and for some reason San Francisco means cop films, Dirty Harry, Freebie and the Bean, that kind of stuff.
Even the noirs I've been watching from an earlier era, a number of them take place in San
Yeah,
Francisco.
well, I just watched The Sniper, which I think you should watch, which takes place in San Francisco, but the first one was They Call Me Mr. Tibbs.
Right, which is the sequel, I guess, to...
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense a lot that it's the sequel, but it's fine.
The sequel to In the Heat of the Night. Yes,
correct. But I wanted to watch one that was really good after watching all these other ones. So I had us watch Beverly Hills Cop, which I think is genuinely kind of a really, really good film.
You can call it a masterpiece if you want.
I would call it a masterpiece of what it is. Like it, I mean, you're not going to be like, well, 2001 Beverly Hills Cop. I mean, they're trying to do different things. So I think it is good. I think it's better than In the Heat of the Night. I think.
Well, you and Paul Scheer, you really agreed with Paul Scheer, who talked about Beverly Hills Cop in that episode.
I really don't agree with Paul Scheer, but I agreed with him that time. I like hearing what he has to say, but there's been plenty of things I disagreed about him on.
With him on, but yes.
Yeah, because he and Amy Nicholson talked about it in their In the Heat of the Night episode on their podcast. Unspooled.
Anyways, go ahead. Keep going. We're diverting.
So one of the things you talked about, and let me pull up, I made notes for myself. So one of the things you talked about was that there is kind of this final message of maybe the cops need to lie a little bit to get the bad guys.
Yes.
Which is problematic, and
and especially after the last week and the continuing protest, it's like really all cops are on the mind right now, and the whole institution is on the mind.
Right, for sure. And definitely, I think the problem we're dealing with now has more to do with brutality and militarization, but there is definitely issues, especially if you look at false convictions, false confessions, and so on, with cops lying to get people put away who may or may not be guilty. Yeah. But I think the message within the film is not that, because I want to kind of point out two things about this. One is which the general concept is actually that the Beverly Hills cops are all wealthy white people for the most part. We do see another black cop adhering to bureaucracy.
Right, and the setup, just for people who haven't seen it, Eddie Murphy is a cop in Chicago. He's in
Detroit,
sorry. I'm not sure why I said Chicago. Detroit. And he does the thing, gets in a little bit of trouble. He decides to take some vacation.
He does not get into trouble. His friend gets murdered.
No, he gets in trouble with the department for what happens at the beginning. His friend then gets murdered, and then he takes some vacation while he's still in trouble, sort of, to go to Beverly Hills to try and find out why his friend was murdered.
Yes.
That's the setup, sorry.
So
it's a very early Eddie Murphy film.
And he gets quickly acquainted with the Beverly Hills cops when they arrest him for being thrown out of a window, which is a good bit of kind of humor, with a little bit of social commentary to it.
Yep.
But the point is, to me, that he is not falsifying evidence. He is not lying about what people says. He is not interrogating people under false pretenses. He's not doing any of the actual stuff that is problematic. He's mostly kind of lying to get himself into certain situations, but he doesn't even lie to the main bad guy about who he is at any point. This is not like entrapment. And more than that, though, the implication is that the Beverly Hills cops are not going to pursue a known criminal because it doesn't fit with the bureaucracy. So they will let him go rather than think of unique and creative ways of looking further into his criminal activities.
Right.
And that is what the problem is. Not
Luna crying in the background.
Sorry. Unfortunately, someone came home and disturbed her, and now she is active again. So
it's a monster.
But, okay, to take it a step further, because I still hear your hesitancy, and I'm not even saying that you don't have a point, but this is the point I want to make. The point I want to make is, beyond all of that, a black man from Detroit comes to Beverly Hills, and the people who learn the lesson at the end of the day are the white people in Beverly Hills. And there isn't even any of this false equivalency bullshit that you see in other movies, especially rom-coms for some reason. But in 48 Hours, which you didn't watch, Nick Nolte is racist. And he learns from Eddie Murphy not to be as racist. And Eddie Murphy learns that maybe he should be on the up and up a little more. And it's like, look, they both learned a lesson. And it's like, I am not cool with this. This is bad. And there's a lot of that in rom-coms where it's like, one of them apologizes for destroying the other person's career, and the other one apologizes for not being as clear with their thinking. And you're like,
those are not the same.
No, this is not okay with me. So to have it be that Eddie Murphy's character really doesn't learn anything from the Beverly Hills Cop, he gains, friends, and he gets them on his side and so on. It's not that the relationship is useless to him, but it's not like he learns a moral lesson from it. They're the ones that learn from him. And I really like that.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, actually. Like,
I had a feeling you hadn't.
Well, I was having trouble, like, you were calling Beverly Hills Cop a masterpiece, and we watched it again, and I had been really young when you showed it to me, because I just had forgotten large sections of it. And in fact, I think I remember one of the sequels more than I might remember the original. I'm not sure. Doesn't matter. But I was like trying to think about, like, she's right. It's great. It's a really good movie. It's definitely like one of the best buddy cop movies I've seen. Not that I've seen a lot of them. But then I'm like, but why is it so good? And I'm like, well, it definitely, it's really tight. It's a movie like 2001 doesn't need to be tight. I don't care if it's tight or not. It's a really long operatic space movie that is not required to have plot at all necessarily.
Right.
Whereas Beverly Hills Cop has plot, and it's really tight, and it all basically makes sense. And you follow the characters easily. Every character has an arc. Eddie Murphy's arc is a bit more physical than it is sort of emotional or mental. He has an emotional arc, but he doesn't necessarily have and then he learned this thing along the way that he now has to do. He kind of he learns to
in a way, he learns to kind of care about people, maybe, because the other thing it does brilliantly, which having recently, you should watch 48 Hours if you want to see something that is mediocrely fine, but fails in all the really important stuff.
Yeah.
The setup for that is Nick Nolte's one of the other cops get killed. So Nick Nolte wants to solve it. Is he attached to that other cop? They're both cops. Clearly, right. Cops stick together. That's something we know. But in Beverly Hills Cop, there's an emotional connection to this friend who gets murdered.
Yeah, they say I love you to each other, which is as you point out, it's you just don't see men do, and it's not a joke. They genuinely mean it, and it's you just don't see that in movies very often. Men just don't do that for some reason.
Well, and there's so much homophobia and also racism and sexism in these buddy cop films, in 48 Hours, in Freebie and the Bean. Not so much in They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, but I can't even name, but you see that in, I'm not sure if Lethal Weapon has any, but it might. I'm not going to give it a free pass. I just don't remember. And some of it, I think, is this effort because it's here are two men that are really close, and you want to be well, but by the way, they're totally not gay. And it's this movie's don't, whatever. They love each other. Relax.
Yeah. And you're right. It's, so I hadn't thought about that. Eddie Murphy's arc is that he learns to love again, essentially.
Kind of, yeah.
It's a platonic male love, but it's still it's important to see that. I remember watching so the appendices for The Lord of the Rings feature interviews with all the characters, and one of them, who plays Gandalf?
Why have both of our brains? Ian McKellen.
Ian McKellen, thank you. Talks about how in one of the scenes, Frodo is in bed, Sam comes up and holds his hand. Mm-hmm. And Ian McKellen was like, I am a gay man, but I just want to see that because I like seeing men be friends with each other. You know, He says something along those lines, and he's like, it's important to see that kind of thing in just a platonic way. Mm-hmm. And like, this is that moment where it's like, it's kind of just important to see that Eddie Murphy and this friend, you know, they love each other. And then he learns to love again, and then the cops in Beverly Hills learn, you know, to loosen up or to these different things.
They're reminded of what's important, what really matters, what they should be doing. Yeah.
And I think you're right. I had been a little mixed because I haven't seen In the Heat of the Night in a while, and I remember quite enjoying it. I don't, you know, I need to rewatch it to really compare it to Beverly Hills Cop and think about, you know, the many concepts and themes and all these things. But I think you're right. I hadn't thought about that. And like, in some ways, I think I was chafing a little bit because it's almost like Eddie Murphy. It felt like Eddie Murphy didn't have enough of a change. Like, he's not super cop, but he like comes in and he's the one who kind of knows how to do it. He doesn't like learn enough. But now that I think about it, he does learn to love again.
Right. And I think the thing that I recall from In the Heat of the Night, which I think I've watched more recently than you, is there is this edge of like, well, Sidney Poitier needs to learn as well. And it's like, maybe, but I don't know. Again, it's like, one guy's racist and the other doesn't realize that people are racist, so they both need to. It's like it's just false equivalency to me a little bit. And also, In the Heat of the Night was made, you know, before Beverly Hills Cop. And for the record, I'm not saying that Beverly Hills Cop is the most woke progressive film in the world. I think that there are things that it could have addressed that it didn't. But I you know, and it probably doesn't help that I've been watching all these other films that are like, oh man, like
you're coming from a low point to like.
I think there are implications deliberately in the film about race and so on, including him being thrown out of a window and arrested for it. I think it's kind of funny that they basically made the bad guy European as like, well, it's not white Americans. It's those white Europeans that are the problem. But that was also just kind of an 80s trope in general to make.
I was gonna say, isn't
especially
like also like that?
Especially like Eastern Europeans.
I you know, but with I have been, you and me will listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, and I've always, I don't know why, but I've always been curious about police and police reform, and I'm not an expert on it, but with the news being what it is right now about police reform or police or just completely abolishing the police and instituting something else in its place, you know, I can't watch this movie without that being on the mind, obviously. And right. So like, or at least think about it without that being on the mind. And so that's why it's like, I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, Eddie Murphy is like lying to do the things he needs to do to get into the places he needs to get into. And he's like, you know, he's kind of fudging the rules here and there, and he's like ditching his cop, you know, escort friends. They're not his friends. There's his escort for most of the time. And it's like, in the movie world, it totally works, and I totally get all the things you're saying. And in the real world, it's like, this is a fantasy. I mean, it's a fantasy anyways. Any movie is a fantasy. But like, this is more so a fantasy, and like, I don't think cops like work like that. You know, I have a general distrust of cops. I don't know why. You know, and yet we need something to do a thing that serves similar functions as a cop, whether that's not the cops or whatever. So it's like it's like hard to grapple with all those things in my head, which is why it's not the movie's fault, but it's also like you have to take that into account, still thinking modern about this movie made.
Right, but also the cops of the early 80s were different than the cops we have now. And it's not that they were better. There were different problems. They weren't as militarized and funded. The TV show Cops hadn't come out to kind of glorify certain behavior.
Yeah.
So on. I had the same issues with Dirty Harry to a degree, and I had to kind of remind myself about the problems that were going on at the time, which is where you had a lot of serial killers that weren't getting caught and a lot of crime. And, you know, the movie kind of presents it as an institutional problem that like a cop, you know, that drives, you know, and what Harry does to solve the situation is deeply uncomfortable to me and way more problematic than Beverly Hills Cop. So I'm not no false equivalency here.
Yes, right.
But looking at it from that point of view, I could see how, for me as a modern person, it's impossible to see Dirty Harry as not a cop. Whereas the part of the point of that film is that the institution of law and order is wrong to the point where this cop can't fit within it. Like there's no way to be a good cop and accomplish things and so on. So there is a little bit of stuff there. But Dirty Harry, unlike Eddie Murphy, within the movie is doing some pretty and
certainly Eddie Murphy himself is so charming and so good in Beverly Hills Cop. I mean, it makes me want to. I didn't pay full attention when we watched Dolomite Is My Name, and I really want to go back and rewatch it because he's so good in that. And it's interesting. Like, I wonder if some of him being that way helps. Like, they're obviously all cops. I mean, from different situations, but like, I wonder if that doesn't help sort of loosen how we think about him as a cop. Yeah,
I mean, certainly him being charming helps. Whereas I don't find Clint Eastwood as charming. Like, he just, like, not even as a value statement. Like, his persona is not one of charm. And
not so much, no. Yeah.
But anyway, I don't want to harp on Beverly Hills Cop too much more. I do think it is the best of those films, and I recommend it to people.
Yes.